So last week, I had former SBU spokesperson Sarah Ashton Cirillo on this show. And during that conversation, he made a striking claim that journalist Johnny Miller had been arrested by Russian authorities, allegedly under suspicion of being a Ukrainian spy.
If you're talking Johnny Miller, right? Johnny and I have pushed back and forth on Twitter sometimes. He was working for Press TV, which is Iran's state agency. He was working. But when he got picked up, when Johnny Miller got picked up by the Russians for giving away what looked to be air defense locations, I thought that was horrible because they knew that he was not on the side of anybody, and he chose to be a journalist reporting from Russia.
So this allegation didn't go unnoticed. Johnny Miller, a British journalist currently based in Moscow, has been reporting on the war in Ukraine for the last 3 years. And he spent time both in Kiev and in the Russian-controlled areas like Crimea and Donbass. So when he heard about what was being said about him on this show, he responded and he didn't hold back. He took to X, calling the claim a complete lie and an outrageous smear. He said he's never been arrested. And he accused Sarah of peddling an accusation that could lead to real-world death threats and harm against him.
So Sarah Ashton Cirillo, the well-known Ukrainian-American influencer, if you like, has just gone on the Kim Iverson show and spread lies about me that I was arrested by the Russians for giving away military locations. These lies have been spread about me by major accounts on X for over a year now. I've always ignored it, but I think now I need to address it and tell the story. It's an interesting story.
So since then, the two have been locked in a back and forth online battle, trading accusations and questioning each other's credibility. So to set the record straight and to give him a chance to respond directly, I've invited Johnny Miller onto the show today. So we're not going to only talk about that claim, but also about the real world consequences this false accusation has had on his life, from death threats to people following him in the street. He says being labeled a Ukrainian spy has put him in genuine danger and forced him to constantly think about his security. It's gotten so serious, he's now seeking asylum in Russia, fearing that returning to the UK could result in his arrest, something that's already happened to several other journalists who've challenged the official line on the war. So glad to have Johnny here on the show. Johnny, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Kim. Good to speak to you again.
Okay, so let's talk about this controversy with the guest I had on last week, Sarah Ashton Cirillo, and the claims that she or he had made about you. The claim being that you had been picked up by Russian authorities, and that the idea was that you were a Ukrainian spy. But you're saying that that allegation has caused you a significant amount of stress and harm, not just from her, but the allegation have been made throughout time. I mean, when did this allegation begin?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really want to focus on Sarah Ashton Cirillo. I don't think she's actually lying. I think she's just been told things by people, and she's repeating that lie and spreading that lie. It all came from when I reported in Crimea over a year ago now. I happened to be in Crimea, Sevastopol harbor, just as a major Ukrainian missile attack was happening on the city. So I pulled out my phone and started recording. And the video went viral, and I made a report about what happened, what was hit, very accurate, honest piece of on-the-ground reporting. Got back to my hotel and uploaded it, and it went viral. And after that, a friend of mine, a journalist friend in Crimea, messaged me and said, "Johnny, they're looking for you." I said, "Who?" And she said, "The Russians." And she sent me a screen grab of the biggest Telegram channel in Crimea saying, "We need to find this British guy. We think he works for Ukraine." So I'm in my Airbnb apartment in Sevastopol, and I was smoking at the time. So I'm chain smoking cigarettes, thinking, what the hell do I do? My face is all around Sevastopol, and people are looking for me. So then my friends reached out to the Telegram channel. Telegram is how Russian people find news, basically. And told them who I was. I was just a journalist, did a lot of work in Donbass. Local news crews reached out to me. Russian television did. And so then I felt, okay, it's okay. I can leave the house now. But I later found out it was a major campaign from the Ukrainian side to make the Russians, try to persuade the Russians that I was a Ukrainian agent and to arrest me. And since then, there has been a major campaign by huge X accounts. I don't know how many of your viewers following the Ukraine war in depth on X, but there's some major Ukrainian, not actually Ukrainian, but European and American influencers. I suspect they have links to agencies, to be honest with you, and huge accounts, hundreds of thousands of followers, and hundreds of trolls all writing the same thing. Johnny Miller has been given giving away Russian military locations in Crimea. Thank you, Johnny Miller. You're a British or you're a Ukrainian agent. It's an organized campaign to make my life difficult in Russia, to try and persuade the Russians that I'm a Ukrainian agent. And I've just ignored it for so long. But then I was sent a link by one of my followers on X saying, have you seen on the Kim Iverson show, you're mentioned a few times. So I watched it. And I saw that Sarah Ashton Cirillo was repeating the same lies, that I've been giving away Russian military positions. I'm very professional in my work. I report accurately and honestly on the front line. Yes, I have an angle. Every journalist has an angle. You know that, Kim. I believe there should be peace talks in Ukraine. I believe that NATO and Ukraine have made a mistake. Particularly Britain and Europe. You know, I'm a British patriot, a European patriot, and I believe they've made a mistake in the Ukraine war. And my reporting is very honest and accurate. And it's just part of the campaign to shut down and make life difficult for journalists who are promoting peace in Ukraine.
What an interesting strategy. I'd never even thought about that, but what a deadly strategy as well. And we've seen Ukraine do this throughout the war. I mean, just posting, they've got that website, the Kill List website, where they're posting people that they don't like. And they also put out a piece that I was listed in as well. There was like 300 different names that was listed as kind of enemies of Ukraine or something along those lines. And, it's absolutely alarming and frightening, especially for a country that the United States is propping up as a Western democracy, as a bastion of freedom in Eastern Europe. And yet they're literally putting targets on journalists' backs. I mean, that's what they're doing. And they're doing it on purpose. It's not even just we just criticized your work. And if people get mad about it, then they get mad about it. No, they're legitimate. They're actually putting a target on our backs. I mean, they're trying to get you killed.
It happens right up and down the pyramids. I think Tucker Carlson, he lost his job at Fox. It's a long time ago now. Probably the best thing that ever happened to him because of his criticism of Ukraine. I think that's probably why he lost his job. And he's, incredibly influential. But it happens right down the pyramid. You've got brilliant academics like Jeffrey Sachs, the American academic. He's no longer allowed on mainstream media because of his comments. My views are very much the same as him and Tucker Carlson's. But it happens right down the pyramid to the most influential academics and journalists, to people like myself, mid-level influential on-the-ground reporters. They'll try anything to shut them up. In Britain and Europe, it's even worse. In America, at least you've got the MAGA Republicans who are against the war in Ukraine. So I think you have a bit more freedom of speech in America over the Ukraine war than we do in Britain and Europe. When the war started, there was a couple of British academics who questioned some elements of the Ukraine narrative. The BBC did a hit piece about them, and people were writing to their universities trying to get them sacked. That sends shivers throughout the mainstream society. You wonder why this war in Ukraine has caused huge damage to the British and European economies, but almost nobody in the British and European civil society, mainstream journalism, politics has questioned it. Why? Because they'll try to ruin your life. And for me, an on-the-ground reporter who's reported from Kiev to start with, and I left Kiev because I feared arrest from the Ukrainians, and then went to the Russian side, and I've been reporting honestly and accurately to try to bring peace to Ukraine. They've gone after me in extreme ways, all these dirty tactics. I know a German journalist who's facing jail in Germany for reporting in Donbass. I know a French journalist who got stabbed just after he left Donbass. I can go on with other people, but they try to shut down all criticism of NATO and Ukrainian policies and those promoting peace in Ukraine.
Yeah. I mean, I want to get to that because I know that you've had to seek asylum in Russia, but I think it's one thing. We've been facing a lot of censorship for sure and being discredited and called all kinds of names. And, how many of us have been labeled as Russian assets or, working for Russia or something, Putin puppets. But it's a whole different level what Ukraine is doing on the ground there in Ukraine by literally putting a target on your back for murder. I mean, it's one thing to silence critics, and that's happened throughout time, not just with the Ukraine war, but a variety of other different conflicts, right? We've got Israel, Palestine, we're seeing that happening. Vietnam War was another example of this. So there's been times throughout history where critics would get silenced, censored, smeared, labeled, but to actually be listed and harassed in this way, I mean, Ukraine going after you while you were at that time, were you in Crimea at the time when you filmed that video? Is that where you were?
Yeah.
So for Ukraine to put out this to start this rumor that you are really working for Ukraine while you're standing in Russian territory, that's life-threatening. That's a whole different level than
Listen,
just
it's
silencing you and discrediting you. That's trying to silence you through death.
it's it's worse than that. So when I when I got back to my apartment after all this happened, I got back and my then girlfriend in Moscow called me up and said, "What the hell?" They deleted our entire Telegram history and sent death threats from my girlfriend's account to me. "We know where you are. You're dead. We'll see you soon." They also went after my best friend in Russia, Alina Lips, a German journalist. They went after my girlfriend and my best friend. And when they send you serious death threats, they go after who you love the most. It's psychological, right?
Yeah.
So
when you say that they just, sorry to interrupt you, but when you say that they deleted your Telegram, what do you mean the history?
So with my girlfriend, I must have had thousands of messages, right? All gone.
Between the two of you? Is that what you're saying? Like
between the two of us, yeah. Just,
private messages.
Private messages. I don't know if you've got a partner, Kim, but I'm sure you and your partner, if you haven't, got thousands of private messages to each other, and they just delete them all. And they went through all these messages.
But what I'm trying to figure out is, how did they do that? I mean, if you had private messages to your girlfriend, how did they get in there and delete them?
Listen, I don't trust anything. I've got 10 phones at home. I've got about 10 different phones at home because to get rid of this, to stop the hacking, and I don't trust anything. I've had worse than that, Kim. The reason I claimed asylum in Russia is because I had people following me on the street in Moscow, and it wasn't the Russians. I did a story about an American diplomat who had quit the American Foreign Service. This is about 6 months ago, and defected to Russia. I don't know if defected is the right word, but he's a lovely man, a mid-level American diplomat, and he was basically, like I think many people who work in foreign service, annoyed about American foreign policy. He served in Iraq, he served in Afghanistan, and then Gaza was the last straw. So he quit and moved to Russia. He's a lovely man. He's a very religious man, and he's probably just going to become a priest. The Russian government had nothing to do with it. He was just going to just disappear. Mm-hmm. But I met him, and he said he wanted to tell his story. So day before the interview, we met. We had people hacking my phones, finding out where we were, and this had happened numerous times here in Moscow, and following us. And it's not the Russians. And this is the hardcore, dirty stuff, and that's why I claimed asylum, because I had to get my British passport ran out of pages. So to get a new passport, I have to give the British authorities my address in Moscow. And so when you have this hardcore death threats, I know somebody who's had serious death threats, people hanging outside his house. I see a couple of well-known, I won't mention names, but people who criticize Israel going off Twitter or whatever. You get hardcore death threats, not the online stuff, the hardcore stuff. People calling you up, mentioning the name of your kids. I know someone who's that's happened to. You get this hardcore stuff, and you have to. So there's a whole other level of this kind of hardcore death threats, and people getting killed. I know 2 people in this war who've survived assassination attempts. One a car bombing in Moscow, one a stabbing in Turkey just after you left Donbass. And there's reasons they'd be more targeted than me. Things get very real, and so. Yeah, that's why I claimed asylum ultimately, because I'm scared of my safety. And I hope that when the war ends and there's peace between Britain and Russia, that things will die down. Because I've always been very honest in all my reporting. And it's not acceptable to threaten the lives of journalists. And that's what's been happening in this war. That's what Ukraine, and I think it's happening from further west than Ukraine. I don't think it's just Ukraine.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about your asylum there. Well, first of all, just give us a little background. How did you said you were first reporting from Kiev. How did you decide to go there at the beginning of the war? Had you been there previously, like Gonzalo Lira had been in Ukraine for personal reasons, had a family there? What was your reason for being there?
I got a call from a broadcaster. I mean, I reported from Libya, Syria, conflicts around Africa, Asia. I'm an experienced conflict reporter. And I stopped for years because of the stress of it. But then when the war in Ukraine started, I'm British. I'm a European. This is my continent. I care about issues all around the world. But this is my continent. This is And so when the war started, I became very interested. And then I got a call from a broadcaster. Do you want to go So I said, which side? And they said, well, the Ukrainian side. So I went to Ukraine, to Kiev, and after a few days, I realized that I needed to leave. I've been deported from two countries before for my reporting. Israel, one of them, or rather kicked out before I could get in, and violently deported from Bahrain 10 years ago now. I know how quickly the net can
Huh.
close, That's why if you want to speak about Gonzalo Lira, I don't have a problem with Ukrainians silencing him, arresting him. They should have just deported him, but that's war, that's conflict. You have to be very careful as an on-the-ground reporter. So I got to Ukraine, and people were disappearing. If you're pro-Russian, I'm not. People say I'm a pro-Russian journalist. I am a pro-Russian journalist. I'm also the most pro-Ukrainian journalist I think is reported in this war. I'm also a pro-Western journalist because I believe in peace talks. But if you're critical of the Ukrainian government and the NATO side, if you're seen as pro-Russian, you can't be reporting from the Ukrainian side of the conflict. Just like if you can't go to Donbass on the Russian side of the conflict and start reporting pro-Ukrainian stuff. The Russians will arrest you and deport you. That's the reality. There's an American journalist
Yeah.
who was reporting from Israel, and he made a report, a very good report. The Israeli government didn't like it, and so they arrested him and kicked him out. That's what they should have done to Gonzalo Lira. But so I
Yeah.
went to Kiev to start with. I left because I feared arrest. I knew that it wouldn't end well for me. And so then I applied to go to the Russian side, and I've been here pretty much ever since.
And so what made you want to apply for, you have asylum in Russia? Is that the actual term?
I have temporary asylum. So, I love human stories, particularly about journalists. There's been a number of journalists, some of whom become my friends, who face persecution because of their reporting in Donbass. Alina Lipp is one of them, a German journalist who's facing jail in Germany. And so then it inevitably became my turn. And it's a fascinating story, and I've been trying to find ways to tell it. And I try to do some on Twitter sometimes, but it's, essentially, over the last 2 years particularly, there's a huge persecution of journalists, Western journalists, who reported in Donbass. So a British guy was sanctioned by the British government, which is an extreme act. German journalist facing jail in Germany. As I said before, a French journalist who was also working with the Donbass authorities was stabbed just after he got out of went to Turkey just after he got out of Donbass. He blames the Ukrainians for that. There's all this persecution, and so that was mounting. So then the Russians allowed me to stay. I did 3 months in Donbass at the start of the war, and I went back to London, and I wasn't worried about that. Stayed in London for a month, went back, but then the persecution started, and then the threats started. Then I started getting put on Midot Vodets, the Peacemaker. You're probably on that as well, Kim, are you?
Yeah, that's the one.
The Ukrainian hit list people
Which
call it.
one is that? I don't know if I'm on that one. I don't dare check. I heard that if you check, then they'll put you on. If you type a name in or something,
I did a story about children being put on that list. For those who don't know, it's a website by Ukrainian ultranationalists, which has links to the Ukrainian government, which basically puts anybody who they see as a threat to Ukraine on the list. And when there's an Italian journalist who was killed in Donbass, and they have liquidated with a big red cross over his face.
Right.
So it's promoting the killing of Western journalists, mainly Ukrainians and Russians, actually, but also Western. And I did a story about children were being put on that list. Children in Donbass, 13-year-old girl, crazy stuff, real extremism. So I did a story, and I wrote, just as a journalist to them for comment. They didn't reply to me; they just put me on the list. And so all the stuff they write about me just gets updated. So then these things started happening. I didn't take that very seriously at the time. If you're a Western journalist, you're on that list. I don't think you really need to worry too much. But let me tell you, if you're a Russian or Ukrainian, and increasingly people like myself, you do need to worry. And then it was more than that. Then the Ukrainian government started calling me an enemy of Ukraine. They started publishing on their Telegram channels pictures of me with a Russian flag. I've never held a Russian flag in my life, but they Photoshop it on. All this pressure. And then more, but then all this stuff, they hack my phones. I go on X one day and I see letters that I've written to the Russian government appear on X, major accounts on X, and perfectly normal letters. I'm a journalist and I need to work in Russia. So of course I've written the Russian government letters asking for permission to film. So I go on X one day and I see my letters get hacked from my accounts on major accounts on X. all this stuff they try to silence you, to intimidate you, to make you scared for your life. I read what Western institutions accuse the Russian FSB of doing to silence Ukrainian opposition journalists. They accuse them
Hmm.
of hacking phones and threatening loved ones. They accuse them of using internet sites like Reddit, whatever you call it, to smear critics. They accuse them of making them so scared for their lives that they stop their work. That's everything that's happened to me, except it's not the Russians doing it. Every time I do
Right.
work of some significance, a post on Reddit appears about me, slagging, criticizing me, and it goes high up the Google searches. All this stuff. They've hacked my phones. They've threatened my girlfriend. They've tried to make me so scared for my life I stop my work. Everything they do, they do really dirty stuff. And
Yeah.
yeah. So.
Well, I guess what I'm confused about is why would you then seek asylum in Russia? And the reason I ask that is because it seems that the threat, I understand that leaving Russia and going back to the UK, especially, I mean, luckily I'm an American and we do have a First Amendment. And so there is a level of protection that I enjoy as an American. But in the UK, we've seen many journalists detained, arrested, charged, those who are UK citizens. So I understand the hesitancy to go back to the UK. And I would understand seeking asylum in Russia in order to avoid having to go back to the UK where you would be persecuted by your own government. But if I had to choose between, I suppose, facing persecution by my own government and being jailed for speaking versus being killed because I've been put on a Ukrainian kill list, and you've got all of these, Ukrainian actors posing as Russians, going onto these Telegram channels saying Johnny Miller's actually a Ukrainian spy, putting a target on your back to try to piss off Russians. Because the goal there was to piss off Russians, to get Russians to want to harm you, target you, something along those lines. So then I would understand if Ukraine, I don't know if I'm on that particular website, the kill list, but I know I'm on the other list that they came out with, the 300 names of people. And so I don't feel particularly safe, for example, traveling to Ukraine on the Ukrainian side, like Kiev. I would think that would be a bit dangerous potentially. But going to the Russian side, I wouldn't feel as endangered because no one's accused me of being a spy for Ukraine or pro-Ukraine. But you, on the other hand, so I understand in some circumstances seeking asylum in Russia, but in your case, I suppose I'm not understanding the logic. It sounds to me like your life is in danger, not from Ukrainians, but also Ukrainians, but Ukrainians trying to sick Russians on you and
No,
trying to get Russians to believe that you're a bad guy.
no, because I'm not scared from anybody in Russia or any Russian people. But the Russian government is very civilized. Okay, I'm sure that bad things happen. I wouldn't do any stories about oligarchs, corruption in Russia. That's dangerous. There's the stories in Russia I wouldn't cover. Or but the Russian government is civilized. I just claimed asylum. I go through an asylum process. I was accredited with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I do have contacts here. And I have a lot of support from Russian journalists. All the rest of everybody who follows my work knows that. And I'm not worried about Russian people. They they do have a suspicion that British journalists are spies, but they say it sort of jokingly, "Oh, you must be a spy." I'm not worried about Russian people. It's and the Russian government is civilized. It's it's a law. It goes by the law. So that's why. And I was
Well,
when this was happening,
I'm
I
not
was.
saying. It's not about the Russian government that I'd be afraid of. I'd be afraid of an assassination attempt inside of Russia. I mean, we've seen critics or people targeted. I mean, Daria Dugin, right? That the daughter of Alexander Dugin, right? She was killed inside of Russia by Ukrainian assassins.
Sure. So yeah, but I've got a French journalist who works at the Donbass authorities. He was stabbed in Turkey. 2 guys followed him. So I'm in Moscow and I got 2 guys following me. I interviewed him in Donbass. So honestly, I don't know if I'm saying too much, but that's my reasoning. Now I speak to security experts. When this was happening, and I'm on my own, when this kind of stuff happens, that I speak to security experts, and one would say, you either carry on what you're doing, you either stop what you're doing, and everything stops, or you carry on, you accept
Yeah.
this is what your life is going to be like. Other experts say they're either just intimidation, or they're figuring out the best place and time to kill you. Another expert says you live in central Moscow, you're safe there. It's like, because it is, I really don't think I'm very important. I'm a kind of mid-level influent, journalist, you know what I mean? With a big following online, but, I'm not Tucker Carlson or anybody. I'm really not very important. I don't think I am, but the amount of pressure on me, and this kind of stuff, when people are going to such lengths, of course it makes you sad. And I hope that that's just what it is, attempts to make people scared. But then, hardly a couple of weeks go by before somebody is assassinated in Russia or Ukraine, or there's mysterious deaths. Like InfoWars journalist was killed the other day. I don't know whether that was just random crime
Right.
or something else. You hear these things all the time, so you don't know. And that's ultimately why I claimed asylum, because it came down to kind of survival mode. Like, I'm actually scared
Yeah.
for my life, and I just hope that it was a campaign to make me scared of my life. I've reported a lot from conflicts. Okay, in Donetsk is the front line of a war zone. Two missiles hit my apartment. That the missiles landing is kind of easier to deal with than all this other stuff.
It just seems, I guess, a good question that people would want to know the answer to is, why do you keep doing it?
Last year has been really difficult. That this pressure they put on you, and I keep saying I'm stopping. Basically, I have stopped now. The only reason I'm talking to you is because the Sarah thing, I actually sort of stopped recently, and then I saw the Sarah your interview, and anytime you want to interview McKim, it's fine. But I am toning down my work because 3 years of war, of on the ground reporting, it is tough for anybody, and that's why even Sarah Ashton Cirillo, you had her on. I don't wish her any bad things. She's been in war. Any journalist has been in war. I know half a dozen journalists have been killed in war. I know 2 in this war have been killed, one on both sides. And reporting how many journalists have been killed, particularly by Israel this year, over 100. I know what it's like to report on the front lines. It's damn tough, and what people go through to tell the truth. That's why I stand up for Gonzalo Lira. He said some things that people don't like, but ultimately he was arrested for telling the truth. And telling the truth can get you in a whole world of trouble. And the amount of people, look at Julian Assange, 15 years for what? Just exposing the truth. Effectively 15 years
Yeah.
in jail. What people go through, some of these Palestinian journalists, what they're doing. What people do to tell the truth, try and make the world a better place is incredible. And sometimes why I get angry with alternative journalists. I think you're basically an alternative journalist, Kim, aren't you? And
Yeah.
what people do, normally with very little money, finding it very hard to find money, risking their lives, going through all this stuff to silence them. I know friends facing jail right now. And then when I see alternative journalists criticizing each other or not helping each other, it's just, what are you doing, guys? And so I know what people go through. And most of these journalists do it because they just really care and want to make the world a better place. And they risk everything for doing that. And some of them pay with their lives. So, yeah, I don't know.
It is a dangerous job. I admire those who actually put themselves on the front lines. Patrick Lancaster is one that I watch his videos and I just have a panic attack. I mean, it's like, just frightening what he's actually showing and reporting, and front lines, and, just bullets are flying, and it's really intense. It's amazing. When I interviewed Chris Hedges, because he was a big frontline reporter for a long time, and asking him why in the world, and he just said, I was an adrenaline junkie. I mean, that's why I did it, because I actually liked the adrenaline. It's like, well, I guess there are risk takers in the world, and it's the risk takers in journalism that'll stick themselves in the front lines. I don't really have a desire to do that really at all. And I'm actually quite a risk taker, but that is one that I kind of draw the line at bullets flying towards me, But I admire those of you that do it. It's amazing. And it is, we need it. We need it.
War is fun until it's not. I mean, there is a huge. I mean,
right.
I've been to conflicts all around the world. When I was going into Donbass, you take a deep breath because you know what's going to happen. And I've had some close calls, in alternative realities, I'm already dead. Missiles have landed 50 meters away from me, and it is fun. It's exciting, when I get depressed, when I
Until
get
you're
back, I
killed.
usually get a bit depressed because you come down and you realize, so it is, but it's,
Yeah.
war can be fun until it's not. And
right. Kind of reminds me of when I was a teenager, I fell off a cliff. I was sledding. I was sledding, and I decided to do a risky thing and go sledding off this one path that I shouldn't have sled. And I flew off a cliff and fell, and the ambulance had to come, and I was bedridden for a couple of weeks. And everybody always asked me, like, was it really scary? Or, what was it like, flying off this cliff? And I just said, it was really fun until I hit the ground, right? Like, it was great fun until I slammed right into the ground, and then it wasn't so fun after that. And I guess that's the same. It's fun until you get shot, right? It's fun until so that adrenaline is there for sure.
It's fun until the horror as well, absolutely.
Yeah, right. So tell us about life then now for you. So you're in Russia. You've sought you have asylum there, temporary asylum. What has life been like? And you've been, the last time I spoke to you, I think was a little over 2 years ago. It was January of 23 is when you were on this show before, from Donbass. And you've been in Crimea, you've been in the Donbass, now you're in Russia. Now we're starting to finally have peace talks with Russia. Tell us about, is there a difference between the three areas in mentality? There's a lot of talk on the Ukrainian side, for example, that, well, the Ukrainian people in Crimea and Donbass, they don't want to be with Russia. They want to be with Ukraine. What can you tell us about life in those three different areas?
In Donbass, in the small part of, relatively small, bigger area, which has been fighting Ukraine for the last 10 years now, for 8 years before the Russians, invaded, or special military operation, whatever you want to call it. Those people in Donbass call it a liberation operation. It really depends where you're from, what you call it. But there, it's very rare to meet anybody who's pro-Ukrainian. I was there for a long, long time, a year on and off. And I met two people who are sort of pro-Ukrainian. It's just hardcore pro-Russian. And even if some people even call themselves Ukrainian still, but they still hate Zelensky and don't want to be part of Ukraine because Ukraine's been bombing them intermittently for 8 years. So in those areas, it's extremely, extremely pro-Russian. In Crimea, it's a heavy majority of extreme pro-Russian. I've lived in Crimea for months, and Crimea is, any BBC. There's an NBC reporter who went to Crimea during the war, and he said the same thing. Everybody knows that most people in Crimea support Russia. And then in the other areas, Zaporozhye, Kherson, which Russia's taken over, mainly without a fight. Most people keep saying Russia should pay for the destruction in the war. Well, actually, they will end up paying for most of the destruction in the war because most of the destroyed cities are where the battles happened. And those are the areas Russia will control. So Russia will have to do most of the building in the war. But Zaporozhye, Kherson would largely been taken without a fight. So there are a lot of pro-Ukrainians. The head of the Zaporozhye region, I interviewed him in his underground bunker. He admitted as much to me. He said they'll win them over with social programs, etc. But what's interesting in Zaporozhye, Kherson is the heavy majority of people I interviewed. I said, do you want to be part of Russia, Ukraine? And they said, we just want peace. We don't mind. They all speak Russian. They have Slavic values. And it might sound crazy. If Russia invaded Britain or France or Idaho, you'd be hard pressed to find anybody who said, "Oh, I don't care, Russian government, American government." I'm sure most people know what America. These areas, because there's such a crossover. There's many in Kharkov and Odessa, controlled by Ukraine. There's a huge amount of pro-Russians. Even in Kiev as well. I was in Kiev. There's pro-Russians there, and then there are some pro-Ukrainians in the Russian. It's mixed, but in war, everything's one side or the other. Do you know what I mean? And I've tried to give some nuance to this. but you have to be careful about both sides. But the reality is the areas the Russians have taken, the vast majority just want peace. They're either very pro-Russian or they just want peace, whether it's part of Russia or Ukraine. So morally, ethically, if Russia, invaded Poland, I'd be against it. But these areas that they're taking, the vast majority of people just want peace. And by the way, most people in Ukrainian territory, they want peace now as well. And Zelensky doesn't represent Ukrainian people anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With the potential end to the war, one thing that I have been trying to figure out is why Russia would even come to a peace agreement at this point. And the reason I say that is because, we all know, well, not all, we wish all would know the reason for the war beginning. The expansion of NATO was a huge provocation against Russia. And with that provocation, that provocation is still there, actually. I mean, Donald Trump can say, okay, we won't expand, Ukraine won't enter NATO, but Donald Trump's only president for 4 years. And then the next guy comes in, and who knows what the next guy says, and who knows what the next guy says after that. I mean, the provocation of NATO expansion has been going on for decades, multiple presidents for a really long time. So Russia coming to an agreement, I can't see what would motivate them to say, all right, we'll trust you for now, we'll end the war. But then in 3 years or 4 years, it starts back up because chatter of NATO expansion again. So I guess I'm trying to, the only thing, and one person pointed this out to me, was, well, maybe Russia has a real motivation because of the number of people who've been killed in this war on the Russian side. So they have maybe a motivation to end the war because of the carnage. I'm hearing the numbers of the carnage. I'm having a hard time believing that that's true, that there's that much carnage, like 1 million on each side. But what is the sentiment there?
I'll tell you that. That's a 1 in 140.
Okay, so right. So what is it? I mean, what are you hearing in Russia? What's the sentiment? How do the people feel about this war? Are they ready to just give up and say, yeah, we just have to end it?
No, Russia will carry on until they get what they want, essentially. But Putin, you have this sort of real Russian nationalists who say, we want Odessa, we want Kharkov, we want everything. I've never agreed with that. I think Putin is a cold, hard strategist. I read this article in the New York Times saying Putin has this spiritual desire for Odessa. He doesn't have anything of the sort. He's a cold, hard strategist. The world is a chessboard of competing nation states. And, Russia under Putin will look after what it sees as its strategic interests. And they do want peace. They also see Ukrainians as their brotherly people. They really do. You don't see, there's not really much hate for Ukrainians on the Russian side. They see them as their brotherly people. They blame Europe and NATO and the United States for the war, not Ukraine, not the Ukrainian people. And so they do want peace. But for what Russia needs is an acceptance that the territory they've taken, I don't see any territory changing hands from what the soldiers have taken. I find that very hard to see. Some people are suggesting there'll be big. I can't see any territory. I don't see either side can change. Maybe some small pieces here or there. It's both their interests. But essentially, Russia needs to put this war to bed for the next generation, hopefully forever. And so, how do they do that? They need guarantees of no NATO. And they need guarantees that Ukraine is not going to be a military threat to these territories. Ukraine and their allies are very open about, we want to ceasefire, but only so that in the future we can try and take back these territories. That, I think, is the challenge for the Russian government, to say, no, when there's peace, and it's a long-term peace. Particularly those in Europe are trying to push a peace that allows them to start the war in the future. So the peace negotiations are incredibly challenging, and that's why Trump is being criticized, particularly by Europeans, of saying, well, you're giving everything the Russians want. But essentially, the only way to end the war is to give Russia pretty much everything they want. That's essentially the only way, because if not, the Russians are going to keep going. The Russians are winning the war. They can carry on for another year, 2 years, whatever. I mean, I'm in Moscow, actually in St. Petersburg now, living in Moscow for a year. Life is normal. It's like it's same as in London or New York. Life just carries on. Nobody really talks about the war. Life is normal. The Russian economy is stable. It's not going to crash next year. Russia can carry on this war. And if Trump doesn't give Russia pretty much what the Russians demanded at the start, then the war will just carry on. And that's the challenge.
Are you seeing in the streets, like what we see images coming from Ukraine of, mothers holding onto their sons who are being forcibly conscripted into the war. Is there anything like that happening in Russia?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, my best friend in Russia, her brother is mobilized, fighting in Donbass. And there's a lot of stories. The fighting on the front line is tough. Let me tell you, it's tough. I know that from experience. I know that from stories. It's tough. The Ukrainians are tough people. The Russians are tough people. NATO's backed them as much as possible. So the fighting is tough. And also Russia doesn't want to destroy another city. I was in Mariupol. I've been in these towns, these cities. When I first got to Mariupol, I've been in Syria and seen Aleppo. That's real. That's destruction. But Mariupol, half of it was destroyed. But they were building. The Russians were building. It's incredibly impressive. They were building. By any standard, it's very impressive. Some of these other towns in Donbass, you drive into them, and you think, just knock it down. So much destruction. And people will come up to you and say, there's no internet and all the rest of it. And say, can you make a video and send it to my children? There's old women, and they record a video because they're just outsiders. Record a video, say, I'm alive. And so when we get back out, we send it to their kids to let them know that their mother is still alive. So the destruction is awful in many of these places. Russia doesn't want to cause more destruction because they're just going to have to rebuild afterwards. They don't want to destroy Odessa, Kharkov. They're just going to have to rebuild it. So Russia does want an end to the war, but it needs the security guarantees that the war will be ended for the long term, and particularly from the European. And this is why I disagree with. This is why I'm a leftist. I'm a hard leftist. Okay, but I've become a Trump supporter because he's living in political reality. He understands that the longer this war goes on, simply the worse situation Ukraine is going to be in. That's the reality. So you negotiate now, or Russia is simply going to take more territory. If people listen to me and Jeffrey Sachs and others, John Mearsheimer, people like that, I'm sure people like you can. At the beginning of the war, Ukraine would have had a much better deal 3 years ago than they do now. And the same principle applies now. The longer this war goes on, the worse it will be for Ukraine. And Russia's demands are essentially, let's end the war in the long term. We have this territory. They won't care if America and Britain and the European Union exploit Ukraine for their resources and take it into the European Union. They just don't want it to be a military threat to them.
Right. Well, and that's, I think, the crux of the issue. That's why I don't know if it's solvable, really, because as much as I'd like to say, yeah, let's end the war and give Russia what they want and stop the expansion of NATO, again, the next president could come in and make a change. And Russia's no dummy. I mean, they know that that's the way, of course, it could be, that they've had promises made and promises broken over the years. And unless the U.S. makes a drastic shift, which I suppose is possible under Donald Trump and probably only under Donald Trump, maybe if J.D. Vance becomes the next president, that the U.S. would just exit NATO entirely, and then that would be the end of NATO. I mean, that's what really kind of has to happen, I think, in order to really mend the relationship between the United States and the West. I think NATO has to go, because NATO's whole point was to bully the USSR and just annoy them and to continue expanding towards them. And meanwhile, the irony of it all is that Europe was wanting NATO and expansion of NATO to stop the expansion of the USSR, to stop them from land grabs. And meanwhile, you've got Donald Trump talking about Greenland and taking Greenland. And it's like, so it was your own ally. It was your own ally all along who was actually going to take more land than Russia could ever dream of taking.
Europe needs to worry about Greenland more than they do about Ukraine.
What's that? Sorry.
Europe needs to worry about Greenland more than they do about.
Oh yeah.
And my first loyalty is to Europe, and it is embarrassing now. And this is why the end of NATO. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a good idea. Europe needs to have the courage to stand up for itself, and recognize that the multipolar world is here. It's essentially under Trump. What you're seeing is the American leadership recognizing that American hegemony over the world is over. It's simply living in political reality. That China is no longer rising, it has risen. That's just the reality. Russia is resurgent. India, Brazil, even African countries are becoming more independent. And so America is trying to become the dominant force in its own sphere. And that's what Trump's trying to align the American policy. Europe now needs to realize that, recognize that. But the European and British leadership they are so corrupt and incompetent that people say this word globalist and all this stuff. I mean, they're so ideological that they don't recognize that the world has changed, and Europe
Yeah.
needs to change its policies. That's what I've been fighting for the last 2 years, making Britain and Europe realize that to have a strong industry sector, we need cheap energy from Russia. And Russia is not this evil place. Russia is a very civilized country that we can do business with. And Russia wants to do business with Europe. But Britain and Europe
Yeah.
are so obsessed with this warmongering that they want to fight this imaginary war with Russia. That's what has to change in Britain and Europe. America under Trump, I'm sure Trump will mess up the world in the next 4 years. But at least I agree with him on that he's realigning American policy for the multipolar world, and Europe needs to do the same thing.
Well, he's just kind of, one thing that you said that I agree with, which is he's just a political realist. And I think and he's, even though he's bombastic about it, I do think that he's showing the world what America really is and reality. I mean, the whole posturing against Denmark for Greenland, and just what is Denmark going to do about it? I mean, what is Denmark going to do if the U.S. just marches in and says we're taking Greenland? There's nothing Denmark can do, and it would just make a mockery of NATO entirely. I mean, that would just end NATO right there. I mean, how do you fight against yourselves? And not only just against yourselves, but the U.S. is NATO, and now you've got NATO taking NATO territory. And I think with Trump and Russia and Ukraine, obviously a realist. And I also think he's a realist when it comes to Israel-Palestine. I mean, I don't agree morally, ethically with any of it, but I think he sees the writing on the wall and he says, look, these Palestinians have been massacred and pummeled for years and years and decades, and it's not going to stop, and they need to move. I mean, and I don't agree with that, like I said, but I understand the cold-hearted logic of it, of just, look, it is what it is. The Israelis are going to take all the land. It's going to be all of theirs. So you got to move. I mean, that's the only way. Yeah, and I understand it, but people don't like to hear it, right? People don't like to live in that, and Trump saying we're going to take Greenland for a matter of national security because it's in the Arctic, and we don't want Russia and China to control that whole space. We want control of it, and so we're going to take it. And I understand all of his points, whether I agree with them or not.
We live in a world of nation states who are competing over the world's resources. That is the reality of the world. Yeah. And as I said, I'm a leftist. More of a champagne socialist, if you like. But I believe in equality and good relations, etc. But the reality is, we are nation states competing over the world's resources, and so you do need that realism. And I believe that in this new multipolar world, peace should be its bedrock. I don't see the need for, and I think Trump has that idea as well. But you also have these other forces. It's Ukrainian ultra-nationalists who are pushing for the continuation of the war as well. Israel is, for their own reasons, doing what they're doing. They're a very unstable state. But looking for peaceful outcomes, I think, is in the world's interest going forward. But ultimately, countries have to stand up for themselves. We are competing against each other. And Trump realizes that. And that's what Britain and Europe needs to realize as well. And the idea that Britain and Europe should be warring with Russia is just absurd. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. They should be buying gas and energy from Russia to fuel its industry.
Yeah. Right.
But and that's why
Johnny,
Trump is more of a political realist than British and European politicians. I have a lot more respect for Trump than I do British and European politicians right now.
Yeah, I mean, he's telling it like it is. He's a political realist, and he's doing what he thinks is best for his country. And Europe has not been doing that for themselves for quite a while, and it's now being exposed. Because when you get somebody in there who's selfish, and he's like, I'm going to be selfish for my country, then it exposes the fact that you haven't been paying attention to your own country. And we have to be selfish to a degree for our own people, our own countries, and the strength of our own nations. I mean, we have to have that selfishness to some level, right? Rather than complete disregard. But
he is, in a weird way, in a weird way, he is kind of the most honest, dishonest American president you've ever had.
Yeah, totally. Completely. Johnny Miller, thank you so much for this conversation and being willing to come on and and hash it all out, especially the controversy with what Sarah had stated last week. And honestly, when he stated it, it just kind of flew by me. I didn't actually know what he was talking about for a minute there. And then it was only after, because it was just so fleeting. And it was after all of that, then I realized, wow, actually that was that is actually something that really has to be addressed, because it does put your life on the line for anybody to think that, especially while you're living in Russia. It is not okay for Russians to think that you're, operating as that that you're under suspicion of some sort of actually being on the Ukrainian side. That's highly dangerous. So I appreciate you coming on and talking with us. You said that, are you still doing any work? Where should people follow you? Where can people find you, Johnny?
Listen, I'm taking a few days holiday in St. Petersburg at the moment, so I'm only because you contacted me, Kim. But my main thing is that my main reporting now at the moment now is X. So we'll see what I do going forward. But
okay,
you can see me on X.
Well, I hope nobody actually finds you. I hope people don't actually find you, and you stay very, very safe, Johnny. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kim. Really good to speak to you.
Thanks for watching this clip from the full Kim Iverson Show, which you can check out Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Eastern. Just head to KimIversonShow.com. It is free to watch. Again, Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Eastern. Just go to KimIversonShow.com to get the full experience. Thanks for watching.